So today we're going to be talking about the team that finished at the top of the Western Conference in the moving forward series, and that of course is Sporting KC, who were able to finish at the top of the Western Conference with a record of 12-3-6, and they finished with 39 points. And despite the fact that there was also two other teams, that is the Seattle Sounders and Portland Timbers, also finished with 39 points in the Western Conference, SKC was able to win that tiebreaker because they play fewer games to reach that 39 points mark, and they had a better points per game ratio compared to those two Cascadia teams. Now, they scored 38 goals this season while allowing 25 goals with a goal differential of plus 13. And as I mentioned, they finished first in the Western Conference, which I know there's going to be some people that's a little bit skeptical of the fact that they finished first in the Western Conference. And I understand why some people would say that they got lucky, the fact that they finished first in the Western Conference, mainly because they had a relatively easy schedule last season, and especially the last 8 games of the regular season. They only had to face 2 teams in their last 8 games of the regular season that actually made it to the playoffs this year. But that being said, as the old saying goes, you can only play against the team that is in front of you. And in this case, despite the fact that SKC did had a relatively easy schedule, they were able to take advantage of that and able to get the job done by winning against these teams that they were supposed to beat, which is actually not as easy as some people would say, because I have seen before where even some of the best team in the league, when they face against some of these easy team, it is very easy for them to just kind of overlook and think it's an easy 3 points, and the next thing you know, they had a tough time facing against these lowly opponent, and sometimes they might even drop points, or worse, even lose against the team that they are expected to do. But fortunately for SKC, they did not fall into that same trap throughout last season, and they were able to finish with a decent enough record to finish first in the Western Conference. But that being said, I also kind of talk about how, well, yes, they were able to win against these easy teams, but what happened when they do face against top team? And that I've seen before, where when SKC do play against teams that they might have to face in the playoffs, they tend to struggle against them, and that's shown in the playoffs. And that, there's also some people say, well, is this just a case where SKC finished first place because they had an easy schedule, or the fact that it was actually the case that they may be a team that could compete in the Western Conference? And I'm not going to say it's mainly because of the fact that they finished first with an easy schedule, but judging by the fact that they got eliminated by a very good team in the Western Conference, that is Minnesota United, in the quarterfinal, and they just got absolutely destroyed in that quarterfinal, something tells me that, yeah, majority of the cases, the fact that they play against a lot of easy team, and they're not as good as what some people would thought they were when they came into the playoffs. Now, despite that, for the MVP of this team, I'm actually going to go with Alan Pulido, and I was actually hesitant to put Pulido as the MVP of this team, not because of the fact that I'm still bitter, the fact that the Quakes did not able to get him, and that SKC was able to hijack that deal at the very last minute, but mainly because, Pulido, he's been having a lot of injury issue in his first season with SKC, or actually not just injury issue, but also international duty, where I remember there was that one period of the season for SKC where SKC was happy that Pulido is finally back in from injury, and then, oh yeah, I forgot, he has to go to do some international duty with the Mexican national team. Oh great, now basically we're not going to have him. And then the next thing you know, once they of course were able to get him back, he went back into the IR list. Like, it has to be absolutely infuriating if you were an SKC fan, knowing the fact that there was a chance that Pulido was going to be available, and then next thing you know, he's either going to be end up into the IR list, or the fact that international duty was calling for him. But that being said, when he is on this team, he is no doubt their best attacker of this team, and you can even argue that a lot of the reason why they might have struggled at times to score goals this season was because of the fact that they were missing Pulido. And that, I think next season, if Pulido is able to stay healthy and at least play almost 80% of the game that Sporting KC basically let him start, no doubt he's going to be considered one of the best striker, and that he has the potential to be a guy that can definitely score 15 or even 20 plus goals in the league this season. Now, for the disappointment for this team, I'm actually going to go with Gerso, and I was actually thinking about putting Felipe Gutierrez into that list, but I decided not to do it because, Gutierrez has been mostly injured throughout the season, and I don't want to put a guy that's been mostly injured throughout the season and haven't seen a lot of action that to be put in the disappointment list. But at the same time, I was thinking about it because he was a DP player for Sporting KC, and Sporting KC is one of those few teams that they still were able to be decent enough despite the fact that they have one of their DP player that is basically on the IR list, and that there is definitely some uncertain future in terms of what they're going to do with Felipe Gutierrez going forward. The same, of course, can go with Gerso too, where this is another year where it seems like Gerso continued to decline with this team. I mean, I remember back a couple of years ago when he was just such a decent player for this SKC team, and then he, of course, started to suffer for either from injury or his form started to dip, and that kind of continued for these last couple of seasons to a point where he basically was not even in the starting 11 anymore, and he just kind of got downgraded to a utility player. And talking about how this offseason, his future with SKC is still uncertain. Peter Vermees did mention about his future, and even he says that he's kind of uncertain whether or not if they're going to keep Gerso for another year or they're thinking about moving him on in this offseason. So it'd be very interesting to see whether or not if he's going to be staying with this team, but unfortunately it's just kind of such a shame to see how Gerso used to be such a flashy player for this SKC team, and he even used to be a great impact sub to this team, and this season that just have not been the case for this team, and that it just gets to a point where maybe it is kind of time where they might even think about moving on from him this offseason. Now, top goal scorer for this team, we got Alan Pulido that finished with 6 goals, but also tied with Gadi Kinne and Johnny Russell. Gadi Kinne was another guy that I was actually thinking about putting in the MVP list, and maybe I feel like I should have put Kinne in there because he did play more games than what Pulido has done throughout the season, and he did had equally as big of an impact as Pulido has throughout this season for SKC. And there's no doubt that Kinda, I think when you look at some of the signings made last offseason, this is going to be one of those that not a lot of people are going to talk about how this is just such a great picked up that SKC was able to find. But I also think that this is probably one of the best picked up. I think any team from the last offseason was able to there. Like a lot of people, when he first came to this SKC team, a lot of people were kind of a little bit skeptical. The fact that this guy was from Israel, and the fact that there's not a lot of teams that actually go there to find some talent. A lot of people think that he's probably not going to fit in MLS, but it turns out that was just not the case, and it turns out he was kind of a hidden gem that was out there in Israel, and they were able to develop him to a very good, decent player, and surely has definitely exceeded all the expectation that they were expecting him when they got him last offseason. Then you got Johnny Russell, who of course also scored with 6 goals. Russell was another guy I was thinking about putting as the MVP because there were times where he was really the only reliable attacker for this SKC team, but maybe the reason why I decided not to put him there is because he went on a miserable run down the stretch where he was really struggling in terms of score goals or even create an assist. And when you have that kind of a bad run down the stretch, that is probably the worst time to have a really bad run when things really matters down the stretch, and when playoff time is really a time where some of the best player needs to come through. Yeah, it's definitely not a great time to really have kind of a cold streak like that. Then you got Kyrie Shelton and Eric Hurtado both finished with 5 goals to round off the top goal scorer list. Top assist leader, you also got Alan Pulido with 5 assists, followed by Gadi Kinna and Johnny Russell with 4 assists. Gerso and Gianluca Busio both finished with 3 assists to round off the list as the top assist leader for this SKC team. So what went right for Sporting KC? Well, they finished at the top of the Western Conference, which was a massive improvement to what happened in 2019 when they of course finished 11th in the Western Conference and miss their first ever playoff appearance in almost over a decade. And I also think that they are probably the most improved team in terms or the most improved team in MLS, because I don't think there's any other team that have gone from being a bottom feeder in their conference to instantly just become the best team in the Western Conference in just one season like that. So that's another thing that also kind of went right for them, and that I think that's another thing that SKC should be proud of themselves. And the fact that most of the signings that they made in the offseason has been an absolute hit. Talk about Gadi Kinda and also Alan Pulido. Both of these signings has really been a huge hit and a huge get for this team from the last offseason. So what went wrong with this SKC team? Well, the defense. And while I know this season they give up 25 goals, which was actually one of the fewest in the Western Conference, that being said, I thought there's times where this defense was still showing that vulnerability and was still kind of look something similar to last season when they had a disastrous season in terms of their back line. And I think most of those vulnerability in terms of the defense happened in the playoffs, where they gave up 6 goals during those 2 games in the playoffs, gave up 3 goals against the Quakes and 3 goals against Minnesota. And as I also mentioned before, when you give up 3 goals against the Quakes, you know there's some red flags in terms of your defense, because the Quakes, as I mentioned many times before, they're not a team that's known for goal scoring. And if you're able to give up goals for a team that struggled to score goals, yeah, there's definitely some big concern it had to look in terms of the defense. But overall, I thought the defense this season was definitely a little bit better, but it's still not at a level where I think this is the defense that could really be kind of an MLS Cup contender and belong in the top tier list of teams in MLS as heading into this upcoming season. The late collapse habit was still there, and we did see some games where SKC still had that problem in terms of closing game. One prime example of that is the game against the Quakes, where it looked like they were able to win that game when Busio was able to score a late winner in the 90th minute, only to have a lapse of concentration and gave up a goal in the 97th minute. And I know in the end they kind of got away with it because they won in a penalty kick shootout, but yeah, that is just something you do not want to have continue if you want to be considered an MLS Cup contender. I mean, just ask the Portland Timbers how it went for them in terms of always having the late game collapse kind of happen and have lacks of concentration in the last 10 minutes of the game. So yeah, that's going to be something that they need to continue to address. But as it is the case with the defense, at least they have shown some improvement where they're not committing those late game collapse, unlike the previous season where pretty much every single game they were committing late game collapse and giving up goals in the last 10 minutes of the game. And then finally, the last thing that went wrong with this team is injuries. And I know this is going to be something that I pretty much should just put what went wrong for every single team, because it feels like every single team had to deal with injury or players that unfortunately got tested positive for COVID-19 last season. But for SKC, yeah, they had to deal with some injury, especially on the attacking end. But obviously, moving forward in terms of how to solve that issue, maybe they might need to think about in terms of finding some depth in terms of the attack to kind of cover for those big name players that they lost, which actually technically they do have some depth in terms of the attack, and that there were a couple of guys that did kind of eventually stepped up last season when they do have injury concern on the attack. Guys like Hurtado and Shelton did really stepped up. So just ignore what I just said about as that is one of the moving forward part. Speaking of moving forward, that's the next thing we're going to talk about, and I'm glad that I actually decided to say that what I just kind of came up in terms of that as a moving forward is just completely invalid, because I actually end up did not mentioning one bit about how they need to add some reinforcement in their attack. But one part of the field that they do need reinforcement is the defense, and they have definitely started to look for defensive reinforcement. And it's not really defensive reinforcement that they're looking for, but they're more looking like a defensive replacement and a defensive overhaul that they're doing this offseason. Guys like Winston Reed and Matt Beasler is no longer with this team, so basically you have two of your starting center backs that is no longer going to be on your team, and that they're definitely looking to trying to find guys to replace them and hope to build a new back line, which they hope that this might be the one that can solve their issue of their defensive vulnerability that they have shown in the last 2 years. How will Polito do in this upcoming season if he is able to stay healthy? Well, I kind of already mentioned it. I think he can definitely be a guy that scored 15 or 20 plus goal, or maybe even go for the Golden Boot, just because in the limited time that he has, I can definitely see that he has a potential to be such a lethal goal scorer. Like, he got about 1,000-minute last season. Well, a little bit more than 1,000-minute he was able to play last season, and he's able to score 6 goals during those mark. Like, that's a pretty good kind of ratio if you're able to score that many goals in a limited time that he had last season. And then finally, the last thing for SKC moving forward is that, are they good enough to compete with some of these top tier teams in the Western Conference, such as LAFC, Seattle, and Portland? One of the most frustrating thing if you're an SKC fan is that you know that this is a team that can regularly make the playoffs, but it's all about what happened when playoff time comes. Like, this team has not made it to the MLS Cup final since 2013 when they won it all that year, and ever since that, when they made the playoffs every single season except 2019, they have suffered playoff futility. And I just feel like when you look at this team coming into this upcoming season, again, it might be unfortunately be the same situation where they're definitely going to be a good enough team in the Western Conference to make it to the playoffs, but are they better than, let's say, the likes of LAFC, Seattle, or even the Portland Timbers? I don't know. Like, I just think that those teams, if they of course are facing against them in a playoff series, most likely those teams are able to beat them in a one-legged affair. And that a lot of this of me thinking that there might not be there, and there might not be good enough to potentially beat some of these top tier teams, has a lot to do with their defense. Because if they continue to have these vulnerability that they've shown on the defense against some of the best attacking team like LAFC and Seattle, yeah, that's going to be a huge concern, and that those attackers are just going to eat this SKC defense alive if they're not going to fix that defense that they've been having problem in the last 2 years. But that being said, let me know in the comments below, what do you think of this video? And if you're an SKC fan, what do you think went right, what went wrong, and most importantly, moving forward, how is this team going to look heading into this upcoming season? But until then, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you do, make sure you guys leave a like, smash the subscribe button, and yeah, I of course will see you guys next time.